Happy Mother's Day. Thank you. I was instructed to tell you that I volunteered to preach today. So in years past, there may have been Heather will preach, it's Mother's Day, when my kids were little. And a lot of you were very vocal about that not being okay, and I sincerely appreciate it. So I was told, make sure you let them know you volunteered. And I did. It's my reading week from grad school, and I was excited to be able to come up and share with you guys today. Additionally, it is what we call a standalone Sunday. So what that means basically is that we finished one series, and next week we are starting another sermon series, and this week stands alone, right? What's kind of cool about that is that I can talk about pretty much anything I want to. And that is both easy and wonderful and terrifyingly hard. So one of the things that I wanted to talk a little bit about with you today is the fact that May is Mental Health Awareness Month. Now, this is something that we as a society are just starting to figure out. We're just starting to understand what that means for us culturally, right? And this is something that is super near and dear to my heart. And unfortunately, there are a lot of churches who don't do it particularly well. And I don't think it's because they don't want to. I think it's just because they're not sure what to do. So we are figuring this out together throughout our country and throughout our community. And I think we tend to think of mental health as something that somebody else has to deal with, right? Like, it's not about my mental health, it's about somebody else's mental health. Except that we all have mental health. Every single one of us needs to be aware of our own mental health. And that is something that is talked about time and again in the Bible, because God talks about our thoughts, our feelings, what we are believing. All of those things are part of our mental health. There is a very funny comedian who's out there right now. Her name is Taylor Tomlinson, and she is bipolar and very open about it in her comedy. And she retells a story of her going to her father in high school and saying, "Dad, there's something wrong. Like, I am depressed. I don't know what to do." And he looks at her and he says, "It's okay. You need protein. Go get a scoop of peanut butter." She's like, "I don't think that's gonna help." She's like, "What do I do, Dad, when I feel like this?" He's like, "All right, I've got one word of advice, one thing to tell you when you're feeling like this." And she's like, "Okay." She says, "When you feel like this, go very far away from everybody you love, and don't come back until you feel different." It's funny, but it kind of isn't, right? It's easier to ignore. It's easier to think about it in terms of somebody else or something else than it is about our own thoughts, our relationship with the emotions that we have. We are complex people. We are created in the image of God. And Jesus understood that complexity. He told us to love God with our heart, our soul, and our minds. And we have to remember that each one of us has a different journey with Him, because our minds work differently. I remember when I was teaching, I was always drawn to this concept of metacognition, the thinking about your thinking. The diversity in teaching and how we can differentiate, basically how we can meet people when they think differently, right? Like math. So if I say to my husband, add 28 plus 34, he's going to solve that problem completely differently than I solve that problem. He's going to look for groups of 10. He's going to know, and he's going to do it faster than I do too, FYI. But I am going to do the traditional, how they taught you, or how I was taught, which is that 8 plus 4 is 12, 2, carry the 1. He's like, what are you doing? That takes forever. And he has tried to show me the way he does it, and my brain doesn't work like that. I just can't. I'm like, okay, that's fine, thank you. Because I can't do it that way. My brain doesn't understand it. We all have different ways that we look at things, different inclinations, different perspectives. We are hardwired differently. I'm going to hit pause for 1 second. We have a small group called Hardwired. It starts on May 21st, and it's all about the ways that we connect with God because of the ways that we are hardwired. What do we love? What are our passions? How do we hear God's voice in our lives? And what are our spiritual gifts? What has God equipped us for? So if you're interested in that, I want to encourage you, go to our Today page, find groups. It's great. It's a great way to start to discover that if this is a new concept for you. All right, PSA over. Back to our brains working differently. Not only do they work differently, but we've had different lived experiences, right? So we've been conditioned by our environments to react to things differently. We've been conditioned by our environments to hold things in versus letting go, depending upon who we were and what our family background was, right? There's no crying in baseball. Suck it up. Right? So we've been conditioned differently. We have different expectations. And yet, there is this overwhelming message that we should all act, live, think, and believe the exact same things. And we should dislike the exact same things. There's this concept of normalcy. You're normal if, fill in the blank. Years ago, gosh, I don't even know how many years ago, probably 17 or 18 years ago, I can remember Pastor Jeff talking, and he said, everyone seems normal till you get to know them. And that hit me. I'm like, yes! Because the reality is there is no normal. Hear that again. There is no normal. And yet the world would have us believe otherwise. We are told that there is a right way to do things. Take schooling, for example. So we are told that the right way to teach our students is to put them in a classroom, sit them at desks, occasionally let them work in groups. Maybe they can go outside and play for 20 minutes. Come back in and do it all again. Rinse and repeat. We are told that they should be going to school September through June. Or if you're from the South, August through May. But if we look around the world, that's not how education works around the world. And if we're quite honest, it's not really working great here. Unless you are hardwired for that kind of environment. But if you need to move, if you think creatively, if you are an experiential learner, if you need to have your hands in it to get it, you're going to struggle in the environment that's been set up. There are different ways. That doesn't have to be the normal way. And if our kids don't fit in that picture perfectly, that does not mean they're not normal. Right? Because the reality is that we are all different, and we need and require different things at different times in our lives. But again, society tells us what normal is. What's beauty? What does that look like, right? What's normal? They tell us what is normal in order to sell things. This has absolutely nothing to do with what is actually normal. Do you remember years ago when Dove came out with their beauty campaign? and it was all women that they weren't airbrushing. So it was normal people's bodies, normal people's faces, and it was shocking. Because we thought that the airbrushed, photoshopped models were normal. We set an impossible standard for ourselves. And then we pile on the body shaming, the brand names, the must-have college degrees, all these things that we accept as normal, but guess what? They aren't, because there is no normal. Yet we turn ourselves inside out, plunging ourselves into debt, starving ourselves, keeping impossible schedules, prioritizing crazy things, exhausting ourselves, desperately trying to fit what society has told us is normal. And the explosion of social media has not helped us. So we get to see still pictures or 30-second snippets or 90-second snippets of someone's life. And we think that's what every moment of our lives should look like. It's impossible. It's not real. We can all manage 30 seconds of it. Some days. So we need to recognize the pressure that we're putting on ourselves. This is not coming from God. We need to look at and understand that this is a unique time in history. So I have this debate with boomers often, because often I'll hear, well, we've all had lots of polls or we've all had lots of things, but I would argue that there has never been a time in history where we have the same kind of cultural influence in our lives that we have now. So yes, certainly in the past, there was perhaps an expectation that you would go to church, that you'd be dressed right, that your kids would sit quietly, that you would make a certain amount of money, drive a certain car, all of those things. Yes, those pressures have always been there, and they are legitimate, and they are still there. But never before has a generation walked around with the entire world judging them in their back pocket. Never before have we had 24/7 access to things that tell us we don't live up. Never before have we had 24-hour-a-day accessibility, where bosses, employers, teachers, bullies, students can reach you any hour of any day. That is unprecedented. We are pioneers figuring out what this looks like and how we need to respond to it. And if we can agree that there isn't a normal, then what does that mean for us as Christians? What does it mean for us out in the world? And in our own homes, knowing we are all wired differently. Our experiences are different. But our God is the same. Yesterday, today, and forever. He is immovable. And our call is the same. We are called to be disciples who are making disciples. What is a disciple? Someone that is in the process of being conformed to the image of Jesus Christ for the sake of others. But what that looks like for you and for me It might be different. So we need to offer ourselves, our kids, our parents, a little bit of grace. The journey is not a straight line. The journey is not the same for each of us. But if you think your bank account is too small, if your title seems less, if you are continually told that you don't fit in or that you are too much or not enough, say, so what? Compared to what? God created us to reflect His glory to the world, not the world's expectations back at them. And it might look different than our neighbors or our friends or our parents, but our goal is not to look like the culture's definition of beauty or success, but instead we are called to something far greater and honestly far more freeing. We are called into a relationship with Jesus. One that allows us to reflect His image, to look like Jesus to the world. And this relationship, this journey of discipleship will look different for each of us, but it will have things in common. The two commands that Jesus gave: love God, love others. And I love how clear He is on this. Jesus tells us in the book of Matthew, and you can look at this in your Bibles at home. I'm not going to read it to you right now. It's Matthew 22, 36, 40. Love God, love others. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your strength, right? And your neighbor as yourself. We get caught up in the shoulds, supposed tos, musts. Honestly, they teach you in counseling those three words are red flags. Wave them high. Pause. Should, why? Must, why? Supposed to says who? When you hear yourself telling yourself these things, I should look like this, I should go here, I must go there, I have to, I'm supposed to. Easter's supposed to be served on the fine china. Paper plates work fine. Musts and should haves. In fact, even in Corinthians, Paul writes to the Corinthians and he tells them in Corinthians 10:5 that we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So what does that mean? It means that we are called to be thinking people. We are called to be people who think about what we are thinking. We are called to be people who examine hard questions, who wrestle with the why, who identify when our core beliefs about ourselves and about others are faulty. So many people walk around with their underlying belief about themselves being that they're not enough. I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not rich enough. And we start to base our life on those lies. And when we do that, our life goes off course. Because that's not what God tells us about us. God tells us that He loves us, that He chose to die for us before we recognized the things in our lives that were keeping us from Him. He calls us beloved, child of God. And when that is our foundation, the trajectory of our life aims right for our Heavenly Father. So instead of listening to our shoulds and supposed tos and shouldn'ts, ask yourself, is this going to bring me closer to God and closer to others? Or is this driving a wedge between God and I, or myself and someone else? And again, it's really easy for us to look around and compare ourselves, right? It's really easy for me to say, gosh, her kids are showing up here. They've got their little bow ties on. They look perfect. I can't even get out of the house. My kids are literally still in their pajama pants. Like this is, and I then berate myself. I'm a terrible mom. I can't even get X, Y, or Z done. But the reality is, we have no idea what their morning looked like. And they have no idea what your morning looked like. Think of it this way. I'm being literal to explain the metaphorical. Jeff and I are both in the process of being conformed to the image of Christ. If we were going to transform into what Jesus Christ looks like, there are some things that we would both have to change, right? So Jesus was not a white person. Our skin color would have to change. My hair is probably longer. Jeff's is shorter. Those things would have to change. There are things that just I would have to change to look more like Jesus, and things that just Jeff would have to change to look more like Jesus. Our paths are not the same, but where we're going is. So when we look at someone else and say, oh, they're so much better at that, or conversely, man, they really don't have that together, we have completely discounted the work that God is doing in our lives and the lives of others. Paul talks about this as well in Galatians. In Galatians 6:4, he says, each one should test their own actions. Then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. We each have our own unique story in Jesus. And we cannot expect our lives to look like everyone else's. It would be a lot easier if we could just check a box. Right? Yes, I did this. Yes, I did that. But instead, God calls us to check our motives, our desires. Am I doing this because I desire to be closer to God? Am I doing this because I desire a relationship with others that's going to move me and them towards God? The band is going to come up because we're going to close together in a song. But I want to remind you that though the world thinks it has a voice into your life, it doesn't have to. This is an exercise Pastor Jeff has done before with you. I'm going to talk through it really quickly. When you're feeling the pressures of the world bearing down on you, I want you to walk into a stadium and you look at the seats. Tell me whose voices you're hearing, right? So you're going to look up there and you're going to see mom and dad, grandma, best friend, boss, YouTube influencer. Whose voices are in there telling you what you need to do or say or be? As you identify them, you need to tell them to leave. Because the only voice that we need to worry about is the voice of Jesus. And when that stadium is empty, we recognize that he's not sitting up there judging us. He's standing on the field next to us. Because it's legit. It's not easy. but he never leaves us either. He is a good God who wants to do good things in our lives. Let's worship together.